Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISARR.com.
Welcome everyone, and thanks for downloading another episode of the podcast. Today we have a first civilian guest, Andy Kirkpatrick, described by John Humphreys as the Ranulph Fiennes of British climbing. He's a professional mountaineer, award-winning writer, filmmaker, and host of the Psychovertical podcast. Andy's climbed all over the world, but is used as an expert in big wall climbing, having summited El Capitan over 30 times, including 5 solo ascents and 2 one-day ascents. He was kind enough to email and tell us how much he enjoyed the pod, and it got us thinking how much small unit dismounted soldiering and climbing had in common. Both involve highly trained individuals, capable of operating equally well on their own or as part of a team. There is also need for focused training, the honing of skills, an obsession with gear, great thoughts in inaccessible parts of the world, and the discomfort of wet and dry drills before getting in or out of a sleeping bag. Andy did point out to me the main difference between climbers and soldiers is that other people are trying to kill soldiers and climbers are trying to kill themselves. Sadly, there's another area of similarity, and he's lost a number of friends in the mountains over the years. I saw him speak in Hull some time back and thought he'd make a great guest, and if you want to catch him live, he's touring the UK in a variety of theatres and locations throughout October and November, and it's a fantastic night out. Details available on his website, www.andy-kirkpatrick.com.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here. I'm already aware there'll be loads of soldiers who'll be like switching off because I wanted to do some work for the military, and it was about people leaving, transitioning out of the military. And they said that the first thing you got to do is stop calling people civilians or civvies. Like my brother's in the RAF now. He's another lifer. Like my dad and my brother and my granddad were all lifers in the RAF, in the military. And so yeah, I love this thing where he says, is it if you're a soldier, you should never be like, is it like 2 paces from your rifle or something?
Yeah.
And in the RAF, it's like never be 2 paces from a chair. So,
Checking,
so my dad was in the Air Force, and he eventually got into I don't know how, but he eventually got into. He was in Tywyn in mid Wales, where they had this what do they call it? Not multi-service, but you had like the army, the navy,
tri-service,
and the Air Force. Yeah, tri-service kind of outward bound kind of camp there in Tywyn. And so he got into all that kind of stuff, and ended up in that mountain rescue, like RAF mountain rescue, and ended up being like a team leader in the mountain rescue, and had a very interesting. He basically joined the military exactly the right time, like never right at the end of his life, right at the end of his career, he went to Bosnia. He had to teach how to rescue people if lorries went over the edge of cliffs and things. But he saw like one bullet hole in his whole career in the Air Force. And then my brother joined when he was like 18, 19, and went in and ended up being he went in and basically went off to Sierra Leone, and then he went off to like Afghanistan, Iraq, all these. He's like 40 something. He's been he's a Lord Master. He was a Lord Master, but basically involved in like non-stop kind of war fighting all his life. So
was he on Chinooks?
When I was 18, I went. He was on a Hercs and then like right. C-17s. So when I was 18, I did the same thing. I wanted to join the Marines because I was from a dad. I was interested in the outdoors and that kind of stuff. And the Marines seemed like the one you join if you're into that kind of thing. So I went down to the Navy recruiting place in Hull, and I kind of went in there, and they said it was okay. And then I said I was going to move to London because my girlfriend at the time was moving to London, and he said, "Oh, when you get to London, just do it down there. Like don't start it here, just go down there." So I moved to London and never went back. So I always kind of regret it in a way. Like I have got that weird, like if you met Mick Jagger and you're like, oh yeah, I used to be in a band, when you meet soldiers, or there's always that like, oh, I would, you never say it like, oh, I once went down to become a soldier, but I didn't go through with it. So, but
do you think your own personality would have suited the Marines?
I'm very chaotic and scruffy, so I might have made it if I'd made it through the all the ironing, then then maybe I probably would have been quite good in like in some kind of special forces unit, because I'm very good at just just like laying in a hedge or something. Like I remember my dad telling me this. He was like, "Oh, the thing about the SAS, what they really want is someone who can just lay in a hedge. You know, they don't want someone who can, you know, do like a roundhouse kick and, you know, they just want someone who can lay in hedges." So I'm like, oh. But actually, to reverse, when I was 6, so when I was a kid, we moved around, lived in like Sardinia, and you know, did like the classic, you know, moving around all these kind of bases, like part of NATO and everything else. Then when I was 6, my parents like divorced, and for some reason I was living in like this idyllic, you know, like Wales with the, you know, mountains and everything else. And anyway, I got moved to Hull, where my mum was from originally, and ended up living in a block of flats in Hull, like these. They call them the Misery Masonettes, and they've all been knocked down now, but they were pretty grim. And she got this council house, this council flat, really quickly because the previous tenant committed suicide. I don't think anyone wanted to live in there. I always joke that Amityville Horror would come out at the same sort of time, so people were, you know, wary of ghosts and things. So we moved into this council flat, and it was, you know, pretty. The shock to my system, I don't think I ever got over it. Like, it wasn't the shock of your mum and dad splitting up is pretty bad, but I think the shock of being transported from mid Wales, or you know, from Wales to live in this council, you know, with like a lift that stinks of piss and the, you know, people sniffing glue in the stairs and all that kind of stuff. It was kind of you know, just it wasn't good. But you kind of adapt. And so it's kind of funny. I often say later on in life, you know, growing up in this place where it was very, very grim, you know, like the wallpaper would come off the walls because it was damp and all those kind of things. It was pretty cold. You get dressed in bed because it was cold. It was really good training for later on in life of going to like places where it's -50 and things and general grimness. And I used to joke like it was basically like the Eastern Europeans are very good mountaineers. They're very, very tough. They'll go and climb Everest in winter and do these really, really tough things. I often joked that I had this Eastern European upbringing, but then one day I met some Polish guy who's like, actually, we have very good central heating in Poland. We have very thick windows, much thicker than your windows. So it turns out it was just a very whole kind of training. So Hull's super flat as well. So didn't really have anywhere to any sort of outdoor kind of element there. It's like the flattest places, apart from Lincolnshire. It's pretty flat. In fact, it's kind of an extension of Lincolnshire, basically, Hull. Yeah.
So we're advertising Hull now. The next mountaineering training area for adverse and austere location. I'm not sure the people of Hull might be appreciating their city of culture.
Well, actually, two really good mountaineers have come out of Hull. A guy called John Redhead and a guy called who's the other guy? Dick Renshaw. So he's joked that I'm the third best climber in Hull. So it's kind of weird. But I've this story that when I was 10, they built the Humber Bridge. The Humber Bridge was built, and it was just this amazing, you know, because it's so flat. There's this amazing object just coming out of the ground. And the problem with the whole Humber Bridge was it joined two places nobody wanted to go. So it was a complete kind of white elephant. But a lot of the things I ended up climbing in my life, when I think back to the Humber Bridge, they're very, very similar. That, you know, just the verticality of the bridge, of the two pylon things on either end, you know, it was just, you know, this comes straight out of the ground. And when you go and climb to El Capitan in Yosemite, it's exactly the same. There's no foothills or anything. It just comes straight out of the ground, this 1,000-meter piece of granite. So I think the Humber Bridge maybe it's 200 meters high, but it just seems really, really high. So school, I wasn't very good at school. I wasn't very good at. I couldn't read. I couldn't write. I couldn't tie my shoelaces, and I kind of really struggled at school. And I was basically like a remedial child. They called it retarded in those days, but I was basically in all the classes where all the kids were going crazy, and there was nothing going on basically. So it's kind of weird that I couldn't tie my shoelaces, and then you end up having a job where you have to, like, you know,
your life depends on how well you can tie knots and work with rope.
Yeah, I'm just a slow learner, I think. So I ended up leaving school. didn't have any qualifications, just went on the dole and didn't do any further education. Like I remember, like kids were like, "Why are you going to do your A levels? You just be overqualified." And it's it's so weird when you have your own kids. That kind of mentality.
I remember reading one of your books or on your website where you said something about your background at the time. Your kids from your school weren't encouraged to go on to further education, or university wasn't for the likes of you, and that rang a bell with me as well from my school, because back in the day, same sort of thing. You just going to university just wasn't a thing.
Yeah, it's a real. Like I often like now I'm more older in life, I can look back and I realize that a lot of the barriers are kind of self-imposed or imposed by your own group. If you're working class, there's, I guess in the past you had like the grammar school system and you were kind of forced to go into that kind of stringed away from the people you grew up with. But like it was like all those kind of things like chips on your shoulder and envy and everyone's posher than you and everyone's got more money than you and stuff like that. It's very detrimental really to progressing from that, from that kind of that place. Like I was living in a squat. I was getting paid, I was getting like 27 quid a week on the dole. But that could have like I've met people who I knew were on the dole in 1990 something who were still on the dole. Or they call it something else. You get like you become self-employed and you sell like nuts and bolts on eBay, but you're basically still on the dole. You've never had a job all your life. So it's very depressing. But anyway, I had this girlfriend, and she was at Hull University, so she was like she's like clever. So it's that thing, you have to grab someone who's rising, and you can get yourself out there. So we moved to London. She wanted to get like a proper job, and I ended up applying because I had this kind of outdoor experience. I ended up applying. I saw this advert for survival aids. Like I'm sure you're all had many survival agent catalogues in the past. So I had I applied for this job in Euston Station and I turned up for the interview. And the manager, I think he used to work at Marks and Spencer's. I don't think he really knew anything about the outdoors. And went down to this little tiny room. And so the interview was like, right then, you're in the jungle. What do you need? And I'm like, a hammock. And he went, you've got the job. So I'd read all those like Lofty Wiseman books. It all came in handy. So I started working at survival aids, and it was a very interesting education. In you probably would have, maybe that's why I didn't go and join the Marines working at survival aids, because it was during the war in Yugoslavia. So you had all these people coming through, like British soldiers. You had I remember once like the French Foreign Legion all turned up one day wanting to buy loads of gear. You had like reporters from the BBC and TV coming through. You had mercenary people coming through or going out there to do whatever. So you just had all these odd characters coming through this shop. But that was kind of an introduction to actually kind of making a living out of some kind of interest in the outdoors. I eventually moved back to Hull, and then Buffalo, the guy Hamish who designed the Buffalo shirt, the Super 6
Pertex and fiber pile line.
Yeah. So Hamish, I'd got to know him because really I was a real gear nerd. I just thought like Buffalo was the best thing ever, and he got me this job in the Peak District. So I ended up getting this job. I had to cycle like 24 miles a day, like over this big mountain from Sheffield over the hill down into the Peak District. So I did that for a year, and then eventually kind of ended up like next few years just worked until I was 30. I just worked in outdoor shop, which is it's kind of better than being on the dole, but you're still on probably less than minimum wage, on like $8.5 grand a year or something. You're just kind of getting by, but that didn't really matter because through working in these shops, I ended up like meeting all these interesting people who are climbers. And I'd read this article about climbing in the Alps in the wintertime when I was working in another shop. It just sounds like amazing. There's nobody there. It's kind of extreme, everything else. And I was just like, Christ, that sounds amazing. And I realized you get the bus from Sheffield for £99 all the way to Chamonix in the French Alps. And I was like, that's what I'm going to do. I'll give my job up and I'll just go over there. I only went for 2 weeks. So it was like stupid giving my job up. But anyway, so I went over to Chamonix. So I had no experience in sort of mountaineering or whatever. And I went there with this friend friend of mine who also had a little bit more experience than I did, but not very much. And we just went there, and how we survived, I have no idea. Everything was under snow. No one was climbing. Everyone was skiing. You got no money, and everyone's like, "Why don't you go skiing?" And you're like, "I haven't got any money." You're like, going skiing just costs money, basically. And we just slept in the woods. All the campsites were under snow. You couldn't go camping, so we just slept in the woods. It was
Had you done any Scottish winter climbing at this point, Andy? Or was this the very first time you had sort of any sort of winter climbing?
I'd done a very little bit. So I'd see my dad like occasionally, because he was in the mountain rescue. Sometimes as kids he would like pick us up, and we'd go out for the week. The RAF Mountain Rescue, like every 3 weekends a month, they would basically go to Lake District or whatever, and they do like training, which would actually mean that we just go climbing and walking. So I had a bit of experience with going with them, but very kind of minimal, really. You didn't, like, I know people who went ice climbing, and like an ice screw that you screw into the ice to protect yourself. Like, they left the rubber stoppers on the end because they didn't know what they were for, and they wouldn't go into the ice because they had the stoppers on the end. And it wasn't that bad, but I was pretty green, really. But I had this amazing ambition. Like, it was only years later when someone said to me, like, you're the most ambitious person I've ever met in my life. It's a bit like when someone says you're charming, like, oh, you can always chat up a woman because you're so charming. You're like, am I? Oh, great. I've got to chat with some more women I didn't know I was. So it was but I obviously, looking back, I had this amazing ambition, but what it really was desperation. If you go to Africa, everyone's hustling, everyone's got like 2 jobs, and everyone's trying to make money because they have to. They have nothing to fall back on. You have to feed yourself that day. Same in most places in the world, and that's what I had. Basically, I had a crap job. I had no qualifications. I had no, there was no proper job for me to have. That was the best I thought I could get, really. So I just
sorry, Andy, can I just interrupt? Is it probably to say back in the 80s and 90s, sort of nowadays you can go on the internet and you can book a winter climbing course in Scotland, but I presume there wasn't a lot of that around there, and by dint of that, you did have to be self-taught.
There was more of a apprenticeship scheme in a way. Like you would meet, like I joined a climbing club when I lived in Hull, and there were 2 guys who were going up to Scotland, and we drove all the way to Scotland on a Friday night, and then we walked up to the bottom of the climb, and then they were like, "Where's your helmet?" And like, "I don't have one." And they're like, "Oh, you can't go climbing, and you have to go for a walk instead," and just sent me off. So there was like a way of, if you were keen and young and fit, some older climber who was less fit and less keen but was still going climbing, they'd be like, "I'll just take this lad," or what generally they was, "I'll take this lad and I'll train them up, and then they can do all the hard stuff." And that's how they would, stay in. And then that person would eventually, take on other climbers. And I've done the same. I've climbed with so many people, and a lot of them had no experience whatsoever. But you're just looking at the raw metal of the person. Like, this person can do it. Like, it's not that difficult. So the probably where mountain, like climbing is a very middle class sport. Like, in the past, it was what Toffs did. Then after the Second World War, you had a lot of like the working classes basically broke out of Manchester and Sheffield and Leeds, and went to North Wales, and there's a real boom of lots of like army surplus gear, so people could kit themselves out for almost nothing. Like, my uncle was a salvage diver, and he basically did it using like a rebreather set from a submarine or something. He was just like on, that's how I don't know how he survived. So, but I think slowly climbing changed into a very sort of middle class professionals. Most climbers, they'll pretend they're poor, but they're like an architect or they're teachers or academics and things. So the idea of going on a course, like, I read loads of books, like I was really this amazing appetite for information. And my dad, I remember I once needed to make a harness out of webbing, because I couldn't afford to buy a harness. And instead of telling me how to do it over the phone, he just bought a book and sent it to me, and it showed you, climbing techniques. And I just, so I was very good at, like when I was 19, I was finally discovered that my problem in life was I was dyslexic, like really dyslexic. Like they give you these two tests, one's to do with numbers, one's to do with like boxes or something, spatial awareness. And I got like 99% on the spatial awareness and like 16% on the numbers. So it just meant I was like, it was kind of really, really, you don't ever seen one person in all his life who had that kind of score. So, but what I realized was with the dyslexia thing, what I was actually very good at was looking at something very complicated and dismantling it down and then rebuilding it in a way. Like even when I was a little kid, like someone would give me a model of a tank and I would just like smash it up. And then I would like trying to work out how it was put together, And so later on in life, that's what I would do with climbing, because there was no internet. So if you wanted to learn how to like solo a climb, using ropes and everything else, which is very, very complicated, I would just turn up at the bottom. I would try and glean as much information as I could, which was very minimal, like, 2 sides of an A4 sheet of paper in one book somewhere you'd have to find. But then you would try and just break it all down and trying to work out how you would do it. And, rather than someone teaching you how to do it, you would just work it out for yourself. And I think that partly came from a dad. And like I was never particularly good at climbing, but I was very keen. And I found a kind of climbing which kind of suited me, which was kind of mountaineering, where a lot of it's like psychological. You just have to turn up and not come back down. Like a few people said to me, like, how do you climb El Capitan? So El Capitan, if anybody's ever seen that film Solo with Alex Honnold, where he's free climbing up El Capitan, so that's El Capitan in Yosemite. And people will be like, how do you climb it? Because, it's so difficult. I'm like, well, all you do is just start. When things get difficult, don't come back down. And that's it, basically. So
Which actually is the opposite to how Honnold did it, because when I was watching that, he's very obsessive, isn't he? In that he would repeatedly go to some really difficult sections and then climb and climb and climb them until he could get it perfected. And he's quite meditative, isn't he? Like he said that he'd sit in his camper van at the bottom of the valley and go through the climb mentally. Do you do anything like that?
I guess the longer you've been climbing, like the biggest thing about climbing is the unknown. It's probably the same in the military. Like, what's it going to be like the first time I get into like a firefight or something? Or what's it going to be like, jumping off a helicopter when someone's might be firing at us or whatever? Like, what's the sound of a 1,000-pound bomb going to be, and how well I feel it in my lungs, and all these kind of unknowns. It's like, what's it like to be in an avalanche? Like what's it like to fall 150 feet? What all these what's minus 50 feel like? What's it like to sleep in minus 50 for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, like when my hands fall off? But once you start doing those kind of things, you're like, well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't, like falling that far. It was over so quickly, as long as I didn't hit the ground, or even like people having accidents, like people, there's so many things. Like I was climbing in Kenya, and the guy I was with broke his leg, and he's basically standing on a huge boulder, and the boulder kind of fell over on the edge of a cliff. And luckily, instead of going over the edge of the cliff, he kind of landed on a ledge. And I kind of ran down to him, and he kind of sat up because he was kind of embarrassed. I don't know if it's the same in the military. If someone gets shot, they feel embarrassed. But classic thing for climbers, they fall off, they have an accident, they try to get straight up and start trying to climb again, which is the worst thing you can do, because you're probably going to fall off again if you've not got a broken back or something. Anyways, he tried to get up. I'm like, don't move, stay where you are. And he's like, I think I'm all right. And then he just fainted because his leg was broken. And but when you're reading books about first aid, about an accident, no one tells you that, But so in your mind, you've read all this book about first aid, and you're like going through, like, I've told him not to move, blah, blah, blah. But then you're like I'm on the side of this mountain in northern Kenya. There's no mountain rescue. There's no chance of any helicopters coming. Now what do I do? Like that wasn't in the book. So then you're into the unknown of now what do I do? Like, you're on your own basically. And I think we live in a world where so many people are accredited and badged and qualified, but their experience is in such a narrow, confined, like this is what you do. And there's so little, if you're the one who said, what happens if your client just takes his harness off? What if your client wants to commit suicide and you're up this mountain, he takes his harness off and he wants to jump off? What do you think I should do? And it's like, don't, that's not important right now. That's not going to happen. And like I once had breakfast with this guy who was in the SAS. and he was on standby for the Olympics in London. He was telling me the story that they were all lined up at this door to go through this door in the killing house, whatever it's called. And if you think about the training of those guys standing in that door, like I don't know how often they rotate in and out of that, that part of the SAS, but that training is built on the backs of like tens of thousands, maybe of 40 years of experience and what to do, and they're all standing there, and all of a sudden the door just opened by itself. Like there was a draft of wind and the door opened by itself, and no one knew what to do. Like no one had ever said, what happens if the door just opens by itself as a ghost or something? And for a second, like everyone froze. No one knew what to do. And then something kicked in. It was like, just fucking go through the door. You're like, I bet just go through the door. So that happens a lot in climbing, that you can read all these books and everything else, but it's only by going out and doing it that you see all these things, that the things you think are going to be really bad are not so bad as you think they're going to be. And the things that you don't really, like, you're going to get killed or have a bad outcome from something really, really small that no one ever talked about. Like a friend of mine, they skied across Antarctica and they're all by themselves. And although you have very good safety protocols in Antarctica, you have to contact someone every day on your satellite phone to tell them you're okay. And if you don't contact, maybe after 2 days, they will come and pick you up, and you can't refuse. You have to be picked out. And this trip maybe cost them like 200 grand, all this sponsorship money to go across Antarctica. And all their lighters stopped working. And all they had was like one box of matches. And they had enough matches for two a day for like 2 months or something. So basically, if those matches got damp or something happened to them, they'd be screwed. They'd have to get rescued. All that for one box of matches. And I was like, why didn't you have like a flint and steel? Like that would work underwater, basically. And like, what's a flint and steel? So it's those little tiny details. It's not falling in a crevasse in Antarctica or a 1,000-mile wind. Even the guy who died, the British guy in Antarctica, it's just like a little infection in your leg, or an infection in your body that kind of spreads, or a blister, or like skin rubbing together. I'm sure in the military, the number of soldiers who are like made, they can't operate because their legs the skin's moved, rubbed together in their thighs or whatever. But no one would probably ever think about that. They'd be thinking about something, much more extreme.
Yeah, it's the basics. I mean, it's interesting you say that, and I don't know if it happens in the world of climbing, but something Kevin and I have touched on. I remember back in the 90s when GPS started coming in, you found that people were investing hundreds of pounds at a time in a handheld GPS, and eventually, if the GPS went down, the map reading skills had faded. So it's very similar to that thing you're talking about, reliant on high tech, and a box of matches would actually do the trick.
Yeah, technology, and you have so much information. Like when the first time I ever went to Patagonia, which is down at the bottom of Argentina, I went there in the wintertime, and basically no one had ever really, maybe a few people had been there in winter. And there was one article in a New Zealand climbing magazine that we had to somehow get hold of and get sent to the UK to read like a 5-page article about climbing in Patagonia in winter. But there wasn't any maps, because the Argentinians had all the maps, because it was on the border with Chile. They didn't want anyone having a map. And you had like a line drawing, like a stickman line drawing of this is this mountain, there's a ridge here, that's another mountain there. And you turn up there, there's no booking your accommodation. You turn up there and they're like in this village, 120 kilometers from where you're going. They're like, you can't go there. Like the road's covered in snow. Like no one, really cannot get. You have to get a taxi, and you have to persuade them to drive you there. And you arrive there, and everything's closed. Everyone's gone. So there was this kind of, you're always constantly having to improvise and adapt everything, to all these situations where now, you could book your accommodation, your Airbnb, like at the bottom of the mountain, and you could be looking at a webcam that be showing you what the conditions are like, and someone could be emailing you to your InReach satellite little, dongle in your pocket, telling you what the weather's doing. And so is
that taking some of the fun out of it in your eyes?
Well, it allows people to perform at much higher level, because they know that by 1 o'clock the weather's going to get bad. So they can just do it. And also it's professionalized. So so Alex Honnold has enough income that he can just spend the whole year just trying to climb this one route, and do this amazing groundbreaking thing where before, people wouldn't be able to do that. They would eventually have to go and, do some work, or, they'd be living on, some people used to live in Yosemite. They would just live on bran. They would just buy a big bag of bran, and that's all they would eat. So they'd be so malnourished, they wouldn't be able to do anything. So it does change it. And you don't want to be one of these like old farts who's like, oh, when I started climbing, we had wooden carabiners or something. But it does. It's the same, but it's kind of different, really.
It's becoming more democratic in some ways, I suppose. As you said, it probably opens it up a little bit to a wider spectrum of people.
It has definitely the grade, the grade level for climbers is constantly getting higher and higher. Less so in mountaineering. Like the number of people interested in mountaineering is steadily decreasing, because I think we live in such a kind of risk-averse society. People can't. It's kind of the more risk-averse you become, the more exposed you are to risk, because you can't evaluate it properly. I've got like a 9-month-year-old baby here, and from the moment he could physically move around, he would go up and down the stairs. We'd be there behind him. He would go up and down the stairs, and even as where we live, he's kind of famous because he can go up the slides, all the 3 slides in the park. He's only a tiny baby, but he can climb up the slide and he can slide back down again. And there's 2-year-olds who can't do that. But the morning you laid in bed and the stair gate was left open, you can hear this noise on the stairs, and you go around and your child is climbs all the way up the stairs by themselves with no adult supervision. Like that, that's why you have to train kids to be able to climb stairs by themselves without an adult standing behind them. And I think that's the same in the rest of society. I think people just don't really understand risk. Like I hate cycling because I just think it's too dangerous. So people are like, what do you mean? Like I'll cycle down the path. I won't cycle on the road. People are like, what do you mean you do all this crazy stuff? You solo all this kind of stuff. I'm like, yeah, but I haven't got like a massive bus on my arse when I'm soloing. So, and you can have people have a very militant attitude sometimes. Well, it's my right to be, I don't want to upset cyclists here, but it's like, it's my right to be on this road. And it doesn't matter when you're crushed under a bus.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just not worth the risk of the constant exposure. I climbed El Cap with my daughter when she was 13, and people were it ended up being a bit of a drama, because we made this program for BBC TV. I think it was called My Life, and the idea was it was kids who were having this something in their life that was like a transformatory. Like one of them would do like a Tough Mudder assault course, one would make their own vegetables or something, and then there was this one where this 13-year-old climbs up El Capitan 5 days on this overhanging big wall. And we had a guy with us, Aldo Kane, who's quite well known now, who's like an ex-Royal Marine, and he was like, I'm sure he'll admit it, he was like crapping himself. It's like he was really out of his comfort zone. And here was this 13-year-old kid who was just climbing up the rope, sleeping, tied to the edge of this on the side of this mountain. And people would say what will you do if she gets halfway up and she can't do it? I'm like, well, she just have to do it. There's no halfway up. Yeah. So, and I think she kind of knew that. And I think it's that there's no alternative. Like when you meet an African and you say oh, what's the how's your mental health? They're like, what? Like, what? How's your mental health? And like, what are you talking about? Like, you're living like complete crap all here. How would you get depressed? It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And it's that ability to, some kids, the classic thing is when you go to the park is when you put a child on the roundabout and you start getting the roundabout going faster and faster and faster and faster. And you just see the kids flying off because they've never been on a roundabout that's going fast. The parents will be like, oh, can you stop the roundabout? I've got to get Timmy off. And he's like, he's terrified. And maybe it's a good thing. But
I think you've got to train people. And you touched on physical and mental resilience there, Andy. And I think they're both important requirements for soldiers and mountaineers. And you just talked about some of the extreme situations you've been in. So how would you prepare yourself for those extreme environments that you're operating in?
Again, I think that the older you get, I'm really big fan of that book. I've read loads of books about the military because I'm like a military nerd. Is it who's the guy? No Means Soldier. The is it thingy?
Oh,
Peter
John
McAleese.
McAleese. Oh, Peter McAleese.
Peter McAleese.
Like they've just made this documentary, haven't they, about him and Pablo Escobar or something. But he's a good example of one of these. It's basically a killer. He's like a killer, but he's been doing it so long. You could just like rock up like totally overweight and start killing people. But it's that when you're younger, you have to be like really fit and really strong, and this because your fitness and your strength is like a filler in for that kind of inner confidence of like, I'll just be able to do it. I'll be able to get by. And like I often make this analogy that you might, physical training, like a lot. I'm very interested in like strength training, but only as a way of like not getting injured, but not necessarily being strong enough to kind of do it, because you often meet people who are like Olympic grade athletes, but they just can't sustain it for very long. So they'll start. I did a climb with somebody who was, a incredibly fit guy, but within like one day he was burning his ketones over his, like he had the most horrendous breath, where I could probably go, like we went to try and climb Denali in winter. That was the last big trip I did, 2019. And we ended up having no food for like 7 days at the end because we couldn't get picked up at the end. And I just laid in a tent for like 7 days and have any food really at all. We had some horrible American porridge. I couldn't eat it. It just made me feel ill. So but I could do that. I can just stay. Just kind of get by. Where someone who's like super fit, they wouldn't be able to do it, I don't think. And so I have this thing about the like bin man fitness. Like you'll never see like a bin man or bin person now, like warming up, like doing stretching and, or you never see like builders, like builders like doing loads of like stretching and picking up loads of bricks and just like starting with like 1 brick and then 2 bricks until they start. And there's the longer you do something, you realize that a lot of that stuff isn't that important. But at the same time, you have it's not aging athlete syndrome, but you have something where you think you don't realize how strong you are because you're always doing it. But if you like with the COVID, because I didn't do anything for like a year or something, I didn't do a lot. Like there was like a kettlebell in our house, and I just kind of picked up and swung it a few times. And I was just the next day I was like, oh my God, like I think I must have been like, hit by a car or something, because I'd never really appreciated that you just had this kind of natural strength. Like at one time I wouldn't have been able to do like a squat with like 50 kilos. I wanted to do a squat with 50 kilos on my back. But at the same time, I managed to like piggyback someone 1,000 meters down off a mountain who weighed 75 kilos. There's that kind of, I know the military, they seem to be looking at this a lot now about how to make soldiers strong, and not be injured and everything else.
Yeah, there's a massive push on that now, and they're using a lot more different methods of training. A lot of the British Army used to just focus on running, and now it's about that core fitness and all-round fitness that, as you alluded to, prevents injury.
It's like a job fitness. I think you've alluded to a little bit when you talk about builders and all the rest of it. Like someone who works down the mines, he can be down the mine 8-10 hours a day, chipping away, doing the work. Doesn't get tired. It just becomes the way he operates. And then if I went down there and did it, I'd be exhausted by the first hour because I just haven't built that resilience. And also, it's just something there is a mental toughness to that sort of physical work in a normal day. You just become, if you're laying bricks all day, you just lay bricks and you just don't think about the tiredness and stuff. It just becomes built in.
Yeah, it's like you just progress. It's a bit like walking long distances. Like if you just like put one foot in front of the other, and you can have had no food for a long time, but yet you can just keep going at a certain speed, and you're almost like dropping down, dead.
Well, I think it's been said before, isn't it? We give up a lot easier because the mental side gives up before the physical side gives up on the human being. We're just we forget how robust we can be. And then people prove it all the time how robust the human being can be. But because we live in we don't catch things. We go to the supermarket and catch our food in there, sort of thing. We become, let's say, soft to a way. And it's only when you're thrown back into that environment and you realise that actually you can live an austere life. You can live an arduous life. We are built for that. We just mentally.
But I think it takes a personality type as well, because we've seen it on the podcast. We've talked about selection courses, and on most selection courses, it's actually quite a few people fail themselves. They're not failed by failing a test or being failed by the instructors. They're actually just mentally can't cope with it. And do you see that when you're doing these extreme climbs, Andy? People just have probably got the fitness and the skills, but just fold because they can't cope.
Oh yeah. Like a lot of people are going through life in search of a reason to fail in everything they do, really, and they'll always come up with, like it was going to rain, or But I think a lot of people are like going, like the language people use about themselves. Like I went on a trip with someone, and it was basically, had like guy who climbed Everest and skied to the South Pole, guy who was Norwegian Special Forces, guy who was Norwegian Special Forces and base jumping superhero, and all the way down. And then there was like woman who is, nurse who base jumps, the smallest, lightest, weakest person on this trip. And I always would call her hardcore, you're there for like 2 months. I'd always call her hardcore. And in the end, she ended up like beating everybody. She was the most hardcore of all those people. And it's amazing how people just generally don't fold. The reason someone is this big, hunking, muscly special forces guy is maybe that's a manifestation of some kind of weakness. Like he's trying to make up for something by being this big, strong guy who can do loads of pull-ups, where this other person hasn't got anything to lose. Like they're basically the weakest person on the team. Generally, they seem to do really well. Like if you give them the opportunity, and you don't give them an out, as in you're on this mountain, we have to get to the top. This is what you have to do, and you can't do anything else. They'll do it basically. Where other people will suddenly say they're ill or they've got, they're not present there. They're too busy on social media. Like if you ever gone on a trip with somebody, you should always go on the social media on Instagram and see how many photographs there is of them and how many photographs there is of other people. And if every other photograph is of them, like taking photographs of themselves, you don't want to go on a trip with those people. If it's just people who are taking pictures of stuff around them, then that's a better sign, really, because it's often those little the little details, or being interested in what other people are doing, like recognizing when someone is the weakest person, and it's very hard to like put people in their place because it's not a military, no one's in charge really, but you sometimes have to maneuver people so they become aware of how weak they are, and to maneuver other people to be aware of how strong they are. Because if you allow someone who's really weak to get into a position where they could kill somebody, then that's your responsibility, because often people will bluff that they're qualified or they've done this and done that, but they're just not willing to say, actually, I don't really know. I'm out of my comfort zone here. I don't actually know how to do this, which I guess.
Sorry, Andy, would you just say then you've just got a natural ability to endure hardship?
It's just from going from Hull. It's just a natural.
Again, apologies to Hull.
No apologies. Yeah. It's not Hull's fault. No, I think it is, but it's just the more you do it, like when we're on, it's just your attitude basically. You have to, when we tried to climb Denali, when we went up there, the rangers were basically, we can't stop you going on this mountain, but we suggest like measuring you up for a coffin, because we can't. There's no rescue, and there's a 50% fatality rate of people who try and climb Denali in winter. But it's kind of funny. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of it's kind. Are they joking, or do they really mean it? And you don't oversell yourself. You're like, look, I'm going to go on this mountain. We're just going to go very, very carefully. We have no ambitions. If we get to the top, that's a bonus. But to spend 2 months on a whole mountain range with nobody else on there, it would be like super cool, wouldn't it? It's like, it'd be great. So, anyways, you go up there, and I was with my wife, who had no experience. She's climbed Kilimanjaro, but she hasn't got any experience of anything else like that. But you create this bubble where you say, this is what you have to do. You have to not take, you tell like through anecdotes. You tell the story of the woman who went to Antarctica. Someone had tied the guy lines on her tent together with a knot. She took the glove off to untie the knot. She got frostbite. So within 1 hour, she had frostbite, had to go home to Chile. So you tell all these little stories, and people like, oh, actually, you can get frostbite that quickly, and it's actually very, very simple. You you will be able to, don't expose your cheeks, don't expose your nose, and just be, always like watching other people. Don't leave that there because the wind will blow it away, or all this kind of stuff. And often at the same time, you're making loads of mistakes yourself. Like our tent nearly blew away because I kind of let go of it and the wind came. I had to chase after it down the mountain and things. So you're often making loads of stupid mistakes yourself, while at the same time trying to demonstrate that you're in charge, you know what you're doing. And that's another level of like, look, I'm an incompetent idiot, but I have done this before, but I'm human, and what I said stands, like I'm trying to do my best. and on that trip, we ended up being stuck in a snow hole for like 2 weeks. And then we got higher on the mountain. Basically the weather would get bad. We'd be living in the ground in a snow hole. It was minus 20. My watch only went down to minus 20, but it was minus 20 inside the snow hole, which is supposed to be impossible. It should be 32 degrees in a snow hole. But anyway, it was pretty cold. And then we ended up getting to the very, very last camp. And we had a stove system where, the biggest danger again is not falling in a crevasse or an avalanche or altitude sickness. It's probably carbon monoxide poisoning. So we had a system where the pan was elevated about 5 centimeters above where it should be on the pan, and it created this kind of area where it would combust all the carbon monoxide. Is it carbon monoxide anyway? The one that kills you. And so we went up to the very last camp. Then you just got to the summit, 17,000 feet, and we left behind the windshield, which was elevating the pan because we thought it was just too heavy. We just tried to go very light to go on the last day. And we went up to this camp and we put the tent up, and it was super exposed. You could be on a different planet up there. I don't know what temperature was, but it's like very, very cold. I think it could be, it's in the minus 100s if with any kind of wind up there. And anyway, so I was boiling the water in the evening, like you're in your sleeping bag, you just got one arm out trying to boil this thing. And suddenly my wife was like, Andy, like, help me or something. And she just felt like she was falling down a hole. And what was happening, she was getting carbon monoxide poisoning. And because I'm from Hull, I don't suffer from that kind of stuff, So anyway, so I was like, so I turned the stove off, and I'm like wafting, minus 50 air in her face. And she kind of come round, and then I kind of just like, we are so out here. We have got very little food left, got very little fuel left. We are still a week maybe from getting down to the bottom of this mountain. You just had carbon monoxide poisoning. And now we have to get up at 2 a.m. and start going for the summit, like 11 hours round trip or whatever. It was like, it's just not worth it. Like we've spent all this money, maybe 15 grand maybe cost to do that one trip. That was like more than a year's wages, and you're so close. And I'm just like, I got out of the tent. I started walking around the tent in the morning, like 3 a.m. I was like, we have to go back down. We just have to go back down. And she's like, oh, but we're so close, and we could do it. I'm like, no, we just have to go back down. That's it.
Is that not? I watched the thing about Everest one time, and they were calling that summit fever, where people are not ready for it and just want to crack on, and that's when
hypnotized. Hypnotized.
They have nothing. People. I've experienced it myself. They have like nothing left in the tank, and when you have nothing left in the tank, that's when your tank is called upon in a way. That's when something will happen. You'll be staggering down from the top, and someone will trip and fall and drag you down, and someone will break their leg, and each little mistake compounds it. And already we were so far over the line of what was acceptable. Just by going there, you're over the line to begin with, because you can't get any form of rescue. So we end up coming down. We end up coming down to the next camp down, and suddenly you're only 1,000 foot lower, but you feel like it feels completely different. You feel, and then the next day this wind came, and you just knew if you had been up there and the wind had come, it would have been like survival. It was survival already, but yourself that maybe you could get through it, but you don't want your wife to die. You don't want, because she's a human. Although she's my wife, she's still like a human being. You'd have to face her parents and all that kind of stuff. It's very bad for your relationship if one of your wife died. But we ended up coming down the mountain, and the rangers, when we came back to ranger station, they were like, that was the most perfect expedition we've ever seen, but sans the getting to the top. because you did it exactly how you should do it. And that probably just comes from, like, I've had more failures and successes as a climber, but I'm 50 years old and I'm still doing it, where I have so many climber friends who, you know, they didn't. So I think that's probably where your experience really shows, is the ability to say it's not worth it. Like, it's, you know, we can come back. But
I think that's an ability that's lacking in the army at times. And you look through to some of the wars, like in the Falklands War, and the SAS got caught out in Fortuna Glacier. A lot of that was because they pushed on when perhaps they didn't have the expertise to do that, and actually didn't listen to some of the advice given out. So I think maybe in the army, it's harder to say no in those sort of situations.
It's the same. Like, I've done quite a lot of work on films, and it's exactly the same on a film. Like, no one can ever say no. Like, if the director wants to do something, it's like, okay, and then, you know, but maybe it's impossible. Like, could we get a camera on top of that mountain over there? You know, it's like, yeah, we could do that. Yeah, we could, you know, get a helicopter to fly 10,000 miles to this remote place, and eventually you have to sort of, like, could we just put like a drone somewhere, like, on that, you know? So it's. But I think that kind of failure is not an option is always like a recipe for failure, basically. You know, you have to really negotiate your way up these kind of things. And maybe it might take a while to, you know, to go and climb Denali in winter. You know, it might take, but the experience of being up there, like, one of the best climbs I ever didn't do was I wanted to solo the Troll Wall in Norway, which is the highest wall in Europe, and it's just like death on a stick, basically. It's like, you know, 1,000-meter high, death on the stick. You can't be rescued from there. I think it's the only place in Europe you can't be rescued. It's so loose. They don't want to fly any helicopters near it. Anyway, so I tried to solo that, and I got within. You know, I drove all the way from Sheffield all the way to, you know, middle of Norway, and you know, so I'd really committed a lot of energy and time to do this thing. And I got within like 15 meters of the top after 10 days. So I'd literally see the top of the climb. And I just could not find a belay to climb this last little bit. I just couldn't find a safe way of doing it. And, you know, kind of basically out of food, out of water, I had to do something. And in that moment, I kind of banged my camera in my pocket, and it played this tiny bit of footage of my son emptying bottles of lemonade in the car park before I'd set off. I took all these bottles of plastic bottles to fill with water on the climb, and he's just like, Dad, get away, like, from the spray of the lemonade. And I just heard this little voice, and I was like, that's good advice. I think I'll do that. So I ended up like 2 days abseiling all the way back down this climb, went all the way home. But for me, that was like one of the best climbs ever. There was no summit, but the experience of trying it and getting so close to the top, like to get to the summit is often, it's always down to climax, because then you have to get back down again, and getting back down is where you're probably going to get killed or something, because it's, you know, you're going down and you're tired and you're rushing and everything else. So to almost get to the top is almost as good, if not better, than, because it's such a noble failure to have tried so hard and given it everything, and then to have made the right decision is better than just getting to the top and making the wrong decision. And
well, at least I suppose coming back alive is the right decision, isn't it? When you boil it down.
Yeah, because I ended up going back again in the winter and doing it, but it was disappointing in a way to go all that way to 15 meters. That was a ridiculous thing to do. It was just like your ego, like I've got to do it. I'm so close. But that kind of undermined the other experience, which was a much purer, really. Like I guess you hear this a lot with the whole Afghanistan thing. If all these people feel like they wasted all that, their lives and their money and everything else. But that's kind of what life's like, really. It's not like a film. You know, you aren't this character in a film. You're a living human being, and you just have to accept that's how it is, in a way.
Yeah.
I always have this story about being a kid where all these kids grabbed me, much older than me, and they held me down, and they all started spitting on me, like just spitting on me. So I was probably maybe like 7 years old or something, and just this thing in my head, like, you just got to take it. Like, you can't stop them. You just got to take it. And it's a very grim story, but I often reflect on that. Like, you just have to accept this is it. this is just move on, just put
it behind you.
Find another mountain to climb, basically.
And do you think those childhood experiences have sort of driven you on like that?
Yeah, well, a lot of that feeling like you're like retarded, basically, as a kid, and of having no real, like value, having no voice, basically. No one's interested in you. You're not the kid who's being good at school or winning any prize or whatever. Like I wrote this short story in a climbing magazine. And I remember being at somewhere, and this guy came up. He's like, "Oh, I'm a lecturer, a university lecturer in English, and I often use that story as an example of a short story that's perfectly written." And I was like really like taken aback, because it was like that someone like me could write something like that. But the English, or learning to write, learning to spell, all that kind of stuff is not that important. It's the experience of living an interesting life gives you interesting things to write about. But the more you write, the more you realize that you don't need to do interesting things. Like a good writer could write about catching a bus. There's amazing things going on around us all the time. Like my next door neighbors, I think they think they have very boring lives, but each one of them has an amazing story. To begin with, maybe they're doing crazy climbs and crazy expeditions where you were, almost like someone, like my book Psychovertical. Someone said, like, the problem with this book is in every chapter you nearly die. And I'm like, I did nearly die in every chapter. Like some people might make one of those chapters into a whole book, but I just put all of them into one, like 10 years of my life into one book. But as you get older, you realize that I don't need to do those things so much anymore. I don't need to be constantly looking for some death-defying, because it is like an end game. Eventually, you are going to kill yourself.
Yeah.
All the people you started with, they either, they're now decrepit in some form or other, or they got married or something, and or they became mountain guides, which is almost as bad as dying. You just have people skiing all the time, or they died or whatever. So you kind of it's a bit like base jumpers. Well, when I was in Norway, someone emailed me and said, "Do you want me to teach you how to base jump?" I said, "No, I'll probably just kill myself and avoid all the training." You do see that with all these base jumpers. When you talk to them, like, who taught you to base jump? Oh, this guy, and he's dead now. And like almost every single person they know has died base jumping. But yet they're kind of driven to keep, because it's so amazing. It's so amazing for that experience.
And yeah.
So, it's probably like taking heroin or something. It's like I never had heroin, but someone told me it's fantastic.
So Andy, how will you know when to stop?
Well,
or will there never be a time you can stop?
Well, my wife is always like, "Why don't you go away on a trip? Why don't you go do something?" I'm like, "Why are you trying to get rid of me?" So no, I think like I have no intention of ever retiring, because I don't have a pension or anything. So you just got to keep doing it. But you do, I guess you do like you want something more out of it. You want to have something, like I say, I'm not on social media. So I try to not make my life a performance. I don't want to commodify my death in a way of come back and saying, "Look at this, I just did this," and look at me, I'm doing this, and like people say, "You've not really died for weeks. Like what have you retired?" And like, "Oh yeah, I'll get back out there and do something." And trying to step back from that world of your identity being dependent on what you do, rather than who you are, what you think, and everything else.